everyone, Maurine Kwende here, your podcast host, learning leader, researcher, speaker coach, consultant, and author of the book, Dream Big and Live Your Dreams Boldly. I am the CEO and founder of EMK Learning Solutions, LLC. It's exciting to be back on the show this week for another empowering episode. But before we get started, you know the drill already. I always start with gratitude. So I want to take a moment to say thank you so much for being a fan of this podcast. You take the time every week to listen, to share the podcast with your friends, like the podcast, comment on social media, subscribe to the podcast. I see all the great things you do. So this means a whole lot to me. Thank you so much. I started my podcast over a year ago, and I've had people ask me, what does it take to start a podcast? What are the tips and tricks to hosting a podcast? In today's episode, I will be sharing about how to start a podcast, as well as some lessons learned from hosting a podcast. These tips are not in a specific order, but I will try to structure them as much as possible. So the first thing you want to think about is the audience. To start a podcast, you need to determine who your audience is going to be and where they live. In my case, it was easy to identify my audience. Coming from a learning and development, leadership and coaching background, that was my main audience. I also added content on entrepreneurship from the learning and development space. The podcast name, you have to choose a name for the podcast. I chose Empowerment Minutes. Now, you have to also decide on the type of podcast based on the purpose of the podcast. So when I was starting my podcast, my intention was to share information to empower others in my audience, hence the name Empowerment Minutes. Now, you want to also think about the technology, right? So what do you need to put together in terms of technology? You definitely need a computer. You need a microphone, a good microphone, and you need headphones to block out external noise. You also need a recording device to record and edit the audio. So I use GarageBand because I have a MacBook. You also need a podcast hosting service. There are so many out there, such as Podbean, Buzzsprout, Kajabi, and they are not free. So you want to make sure that you find something at a price that's suitable for you. The next thing you want to think about is the content. You have to decide on the content that you're going to share. You have to take time to prepare, to write a script, practice, record it a few times, and then kind of like a test drive before you start recording it. Now, would you be having guest hosts for your podcast? You want to think about that as well. Where do you find them? What's their process? So in my case, I find guests whose expertise lends to my audience. And then I reach out to them to schedule time to record the podcast and send over a script for the guests to prepare before the day of recording the podcast. When I select guests, I ensure not to be biased. I ensure that it's very inclusive and have balanced representation. Think about sharing the podcast. You want to share the podcast where your audience is located. I share mine on social media platforms like LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. I hope to explore TikTok and Twitter at some point. You need some sort of graphic. You need a podcast cover, right? Some kind of a flyer that says what your podcast name is, where people can find you, and put your picture on there as the host. So I use Canva for my podcast to create my podcast cover, and so you want to use whatsoever works for you. Now let me talk about some of the lessons learned. I just want you to know that podcasting takes time like anything else. In the beginning, it can be stressful just thinking about recording it, finding a guest, what time of the day, and so forth. So just keep that in mind, that it takes time for you to get used to it. Invite guests who want to share to your audience and not promote their products. Tell your guests in advance that your podcast is not a marketing platform. If I notice someone comes to my podcast and is sharing and starts selling stuff, instead of, I'll ask them, what do you want to share with the audience, and they start saying, come, you can buy this from me, whatever. I just tell them that, they're not supposed to do that. And if they already did it, I try to cut that out of the recording, or I just don't invite them back in. You have to be careful, the message that you're putting out there. I podcast on a weekly basis, and when I'm tied up with clients, my clients come first. I don't post a new episode that week and resume the following week. Life happens. It's not the end of the world. Do what you feel comfortable with. You decide if you want to do this daily, weekly, monthly. It's totally up to you. But what I want you to pay attention to is you have to be consistent. If you want to do that on a weekly basis, do it on a weekly basis, because your listeners would get into the habit of looking for you on that specific day of the week to download a new episode. And when they don't hear from you, they might actually, not be interested. Schedule your guests in advance. If possible, record sessions way in advance, so the whole experience is not so stressful, and you can also enjoy it along the way. Hosting a podcast has helped improve my writing skills. Hosting a podcast has also helped me practice on my public speaking skills and also improve in the area of confidence when speaking publicly. It takes courage and confidence to host a podcast. So by doing that weekly, it helps you build those skills, and with no time, you become better at it. Hosting a podcast also helps gain credibility in your area of expertise. It helps you create a community that you're perceived as an expert, an influencer, a giver in your community, which are all good things. All right, that's it for now. We've come to the end of the podcast. I hope you got inspired to start your own podcast, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Don't be shy. Many people help me to get started, and honestly, I'm here to support you, and I'll be listening to your podcast once you get started. So to our listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning into this week's podcast. Be safe, be well, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.